The night Clara Hennessy's barn caught fire, she lost everything she had left of her former life, and the only man who stayed until dawn was a stranger with quiet eyes and calloused hands who never once asked her to stop crying. Clara had come to Cimarron, New Mexico Territory, in the spring of 1878, the kind of woman who carried her grief in the straight line of her back and the careful way she chose her words. She was 24 years old, a widow of 14 months, and she had taken the small plot of land her late husband James had purchased before his lungs gave out to the consumption that swept through the boarding houses of Santa Fe like a terrible whisper. The land was hers by deed and by grief, 40 acres of dry red earth with a modest clapboard house, a barn that leaned slightly to the east, 2 milk cows named Patience and Sunday, and a garden plot that she had coaxed into yielding beans and squash through sheer force of stubbornness. She had no family within 300 miles. Her mother was in Missouri, aging and stiff-jointed, and her 2 brothers had gone to California in search of gold that never materialized. She wrote letters to them all and received letters in return, but the months between correspondence felt like standing at the edge of a wide river with no bridge and no boat. She managed. That was the word the women of Cimarron used for her when they spoke among themselves at the dry goods store or after Sunday service. Clara Hennessy manages. It was meant as a compliment, and it landed like one, though sometimes at night when the wind off the Sangre de Cristo Mountains pressed against the walls of the little house, she thought that managing was the loneliest word in the English language. The town of Cimarron in 1878 was no peaceful settlement. The Colfax County War had been grinding along for years, a brutal contest between land-grabbing interests tied to the Maxwell land grant and the settlers who believed their claims were righteous and legal. Men had been shot over fence lines and water rights. The Reverend Talby had been murdered just a few years prior, and the reverberations of that violence still moved through the community like tremors after an earthquake. Clara kept her head low, paid her taxes, and tried not to be drawn into the arguments that erupted at the general store or the saloon. She had never set foot inside but could hear from 2 streets away on Saturday evenings. She had managed this way for the better part of a year when the summer brought with it a dry heat that turned the grass to kindling and cracked the earth in long, pale seams. The river ran low. The cows grew lean. And into this tinderbox of a season came a series of troubles that tested Clara's particular brand of endurance in ways she had not anticipated. First, her well went alkaline. A man from town named Delgado came to look at it and shook his head, and said she would need to haul water from the creek until the rains came, if the rains came. Then one of her cows, Sunday, developed a swollen leg and had to be kept from walking, which meant less milk and more worry. And then, on a Tuesday evening in late August, Clara was boiling her laundry over an outdoor fire when a spark, carried on a gust of dry mountain wind, found the loose hay she had stacked too close to the barn wall, and the fire took hold with a hunger that was terrifying in its speed. She screamed. She ran for the water bucket she kept by the back door and threw it uselessly against the growing wall of orange light. She screamed again, raw and desperate, and began pulling herself toward the barn door because Patience was inside, and the animal was bellowing in a voice that reached inside Clara's chest and squeezed. She got the latch open, the heat pressing against her face like a flat iron, and the cow came lurching out past her, wide-eyed and steaming into the night air. Clara stumbled backward and sat down hard in the dirt, watching the barn burn. The fire had been going perhaps 20 minutes, and she had been sitting there alone and shaking, her apron singed and her hands trembling, when she heard hoofbeats on the road that ran along the eastern edge of her property. A single rider coming from the direction of town, moving at an easy lope that quickened when the rider spotted the glow against the black sky. The horse pulled up at the fence line, and the man was off before the animal had fully stopped, looping the reins over the post in one practiced motion and moving through the gate at a near run. He was tall, with the kind of lean build that came from years of hard work rather than any particular gift from nature. He wore a worn brown coat, a hat with a sweat-darkened band, and boots that had seen considerable country. He was perhaps 28 or 29, with a jaw that needed a razor and eyes the color of creek water when the sky is overcast, somewhere between gray and green, and entirely impossible to name. He stopped a few feet from her and looked at the barn, and then he looked at her. "Are you hurt?" he asked. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that did not panic. "No," she said, though her voice broke on the single syllable. "Anyone inside? The cow is out. There's nothing else in there alive." He nodded and looked at the barn again, calculating, the way a man does when he is deciding what can be saved and what cannot. Then he looked back at her, and whatever he saw in her face made him stop calculating and simply sit down in the dirt beside her. Just like that. No fanfare, no ceremony. He lowered himself to the ground next to her as though it were the most natural thing in the world, forearms resting on his bent knees, hat pushed back on his head, and watched the barn burn alongside her. "I'm Eli," he said. "Eli Cade. I ride for the Goodnight Connected outfits moving cattle up from the south. We made camp about 3 miles north of here tonight." "Clara Hennessy," she said. "Mrs. Hennessy." "Yes." "Is there a Mr. Hennessy I should be fetching?" "He passed 14 months ago." There was a pause, and it was not an awkward one. It had the quality of a considered silence, the kind a person offers when they understand that condolences are inadequate and silence is at least honest. "I'm sorry," he said. "Thank you." They watched the barn. The roof structure gave way with a sound like a giant exhaling, and a column of sparks rose into the black sky and faded. Clara felt the tears begin then, not from the smoke, though there was plenty of that, but from something older and deeper that the fire had reached down and unlocked. She did not try to stop them. She was too tired and too stripped bare to manage even that small dignity. Eli Cade did not tell her it would be all right. He did not offer platitudes about God's plan or the resilience of the frontier spirit. He simply stayed where he was, present and unhurried, while the barn became embers, and the embers became a softly glowing pile, and the night settled around them both with all its indifferent stars. At some point he rose and disappeared for several minutes. She heard him moving around, and then the sound of her water pump being worked, and then he returned with a tin cup of water that she accepted and drank without comment. He sat back down. "You've got a fence post on the south side that's rotting through," he said after a while. It was such an ordinary observation that it almost made her laugh. "I know," she said. "I've been meaning to see to it. I noticed your gate latch needs adjustment too, sits crooked. I've been meaning to see to that as well. There seemed to be a considerable number of things you've been meaning to see to." It was not unkind. There was a gentle humor in it, and she looked at him sideways in the firelight and saw the very faint evidence of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "I am one person," she said, and there was more dignity in those 4 words than she had intended to put there. "Yes," he said, and the small smile faded into something more respectful. "You are." The hours moved the way hours do in the middle of the night, slow and strange and without reliable measure. She told him, without quite meaning to, about James. About how they had married in Missouri and come west because James believed in the land grants and the promise of the territory and the future that felt, in those early days, like something you could reach out and take hold of. About how the consumption had come quietly, the way the worst things do, announcing itself so gently at first that they had mistaken it for an ordinary cough, an ordinary tiredness. Eli listened the way some men do, completely, without the restlessness that causes eyes to drift or feet to shift. He asked a question now and then, small precise questions that showed he had been paying attention. What had James done before the land? Had they been happy, the two of them, before the illness? Did she find the territory beautiful despite everything? She answered honestly. Yes, they had been happy. Yes, she found the territory beautiful in the way that something can be beautiful and hard at the same time, like the mountains in winter, like the first and last light of a day. She asked him questions in return, because it seemed only fair and because she found, to her own surprise, that she wanted to know. He was from Texas, he told her. Born outside of Abilene to a family that had come north from the hill country and never quite recovered from the transition. His father had been a rancher of modest success, his mother a woman of considerable stubbornness who had taught him to read from a Bible and a mail-order catalog, which he said with a straight face gave him an unusual but functional relationship with the written word. "Do you have brothers or sisters?" she asked. "One brother," he said, "younger by 4 years, name of Thomas. He's working a spread down near Las Cruces now. Are you close?" He considered this. "We are the kind of close that comes from not seeing each other for long stretches of time. When we are together, it is easy. When we are apart, we do not write much, but we think of each other." She understood this completely, because it was exactly how she felt about her own brothers in California. She told him so, and something shifted between them in that admission. The recognition that they were similar kinds of people, navigating similar kinds of loneliness with similar kinds of quiet stubbornness. The fire was fully down to coals by the time the eastern sky began to show the first gray suggestion of dawn. Clara realized she had been sitting on the ground for the better part of 6 hours, and that she was stiff and cold, and that her dress was a ruin. She also realized that she had not once, in all that time, felt alone. The recognition landed somewhere in the center of her chest with the force of something important. Eli rose first and offered her his hand, and she took it and stood. She was aware of the warmth and roughness of his palm, the steadiness of his grip, and then she was standing and he released her hand, and they were simply two people standing in the early morning light amid the smell of ash and cooling wood. "I'll need to get back to camp before the herd gets moving," he said. There was no apology in it, just the plain fact of it, the way a man states what he must do. "Of course," she said. He walked to his horse, a dark bay that had waited with impressive patience at the fence post all night, and untied the reins. Then he stopped and turned back to her. "I'll be in Cimarron for 3 more days," he said. "The outfit is buying supplies before we push north. I'd like to come back if you'd allow it." She looked at him across the pale morning light. The mountains behind him were beginning to catch the color of the sun, that particular deep rose that made the Sangre de Cristo range look like it was lit from within. It was the most beautiful thing she had seen in months, and she was not entirely sure whether she was looking at the mountains or at the man standing in front of them. "I'd allow it," she said. He touched the brim of his hat, swung up into the saddle with the easy grace of a man who spent more time on horseback than off it, and rode north. Clara stood in her yard until the sound of hoofbeats faded, and then she went inside and made coffee and sat at the table and tried to understand what had just happened to her. The barn was gone. The hay was gone. She would need to find somewhere to shelter patients for the coming winter. These were real and pressing problems that required real and practical solutions. But beneath all of that, in the place where the morning light seemed to reach without effort, there was something else. Something she had not felt in 14 months and had almost convinced herself she had imagined. The particular warmth of not being alone. She set it aside, carefully, the way you set aside something valuable when you cannot yet decide what to do with it. She drank her coffee, washed her face, and went to find her cow. He came back the following afternoon, as he said he would, riding up to the gate with 2 other men from the outfit and a wagon bed full of lumber. She came out to the porch and stood watching them ride in, shading her eyes with her hand. "What is this?" she asked. "Lumber," Eli said, climbing down from his horse. "Thought you might need a start on a new shelter for your stock before winter. I cannot pay for this." "Nobody asked you to." She opened her mouth and closed it again. One of the other men, a broad-shouldered Mexican vaquero with an impressively cultivated mustache, was already climbing down and moving toward the remains of the old barn with the focused air of a man who is happiest when he has a project. "That is Miguel," Eli said. "He builds things the way other men breathe." "And that," he nodded to the third man, wiry and red-haired and not much more than 20, is Denny. He mostly carries things and tries not to cause trouble." "That is a charitable description," Denny said cheerfully, and jumped down from the wagon. Clara stood on her porch and felt something she recognized with a small shock as happiness, not the grand, consuming variety, but the quiet, domestic kind, the kind that comes from watching capable people arrive with intention and materials and begin to work. She fed them all lunch, salt pork and beans and cornbread made with the last of her meal, and they ate at the small table outside because there were too many of them for the kitchen. And the conversation moved around the table with the comfortable ease of people who have shared hard work and good food, and find the combination naturally conducive to friendship. Miguel told a story about a cattle drive in which an entire herd had to be swum across the Rio Grande in a thunderstorm, with considerable theatrical embellishment that grew with each retelling, if Denny's eye-rolling was any evidence. Denny told a story about a horse he had owned that had an inexplicable and apparently deeply personal vendetta against fence posts, which he demonstrated through physical comedy that knocked his cup off the table. Eli mostly watched them with the air of a man who has heard these stories before and finds them no less entertaining for it. And Clara laughed. She laughed with her whole face, the way she had not laughed in a long time, and she was aware of Eli watching her when she did, not intrusively, not with the calculating appraisal of a man who thinks he is owed something, but with an expression that was closer to wonder. As though her laughter were something he wanted to observe carefully to keep. They worked for the rest of the afternoon and cleared the burned debris, laid a foundation for a small but solid structure, and got 3 walls framed before the light gave out. They promised to return the following day to finish, and Miguel gave a formal little bow when Clara thanked them, which made Denny snort. When the others were loading into the wagon, Eli stayed a moment. He stood by his horse, hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim in a gesture she was already beginning to recognize as his version of gathering himself, before saying something he wanted to say carefully. "I'm glad you are doing all right," he said, "thanks to you and your friends." "No," he said, and he said it with a quiet firmness that made her look at him directly. "You were doing all right before we arrived. I just helped with the lumber." She held his gaze for a moment, and in that moment something wordless passed between them, an acknowledgment of the night before, of the hours in the dark beside the burning barn, of the things they had said to each other that had felt more honest than things people usually said. "Come to supper tomorrow," she said, "after you finish the building. All 3 of you." "We'd be glad to," he said, and put his hat back on and rode after the wagon. The next morning Clara rose early and walked to town to barter 2 jars of preserved peaches at Elkins's general store for enough flour and dried apple, and a small piece of bacon to make a proper meal. While she was in town, she encountered Mrs. Alvarez, who ran the town's only seamstress shop, and was the particular kind of woman who noticed everything, and kept it all organized in her head like a well-filed cabinet. "I heard your barn burned," Mrs. Alvarez said, with genuine sympathy. "I'm sorry, Clara. Is there anything I can do? Some of the drovers from the outfit camping north of town have been helping me rebuild," Clara said. "I expect I'll be fine." Mrs. Alvarez's eyes sharpened pleasantly. "Drovers? Is that so? One in particular, or a general assembly?" Clara busied herself examining a bolt of muslin she had no intention of purchasing. "They're all been very kind," said Mrs. Alvarez, in the particular tone that conveyed enormous meaning while technically saying nothing at all. Clara made her purchases and walked home and began cooking, and she did not think about what Mrs. Alvarez had implied with that single syllable, or she tried not to think about it, which was not quite the same thing. They came at dusk, all 3 of them, and Miguel brought wildflowers he had apparently gathered from the creek bank, which he presented to Clara with such earnest formality that she was genuinely moved. Denny had scraped his boots and made some effort to tame his red hair with water, which had limited success. And Eli arrived wearing a clean shirt she had not seen before, a pale blue one that made the uncertain color of his eyes settle toward green. And he carried his hat in his hands and said good evening with the slight formality of a man who is trying to make a good impression and is not entirely sure he is succeeding. Supper was the finest meal Clara had produced in months: apple and bacon stew with fresh biscuits, and a dried fruit pudding that came out better than she had expected. They ate well and talked long after the food was gone, and the evening had the quality of something she wanted to slow down and hold still. When Miguel and Denny went to bring the horses around, there was a moment where Clara and Eli were standing together at the edge of the porch, looking out at the darkening land, the mountains already invisible against the sky, the stars beginning to organize themselves overhead with their ancient indifference. "The structure should hold your cow through winter," he said. "I know." All did fine work. "Clara," he said and stopped. She waited. "I'm leaving tomorrow. The outfit pushes north at first light." She had known this. She had been carrying the knowledge of it since the day before, holding it at arm's length. Now it was standing directly in front of her in a clean blue shirt, and it was harder to hold at arm's length. "Where are you pushing to?" she asked. "Colorado. We've got a delivery to make to a ranch near Pueblo. After that, I don't know yet. The work goes where it goes." "That's a life," she said carefully. "That doesn't have much room for staying in one place." "No," he agreed. "It hasn't, not so far." She looked at him then, and he was already looking at her, and the look between them lasted several seconds too long to be casual. Her heart, which she had persuaded over 14 months of widowhood to behave itself and be sensible, was conducting itself with complete disregard for the lecture she had given it. "I'd like to write to you," he said, "if you permit it." "I permit it," she said. "I'll need an address." "General Delivery, Cimarron, New Mexico Territory. It'll find me." He nodded, and the particular way he pressed his lips together for a moment suggested that he was regulating something, some impulse toward a different kind of farewell that he was choosing not to act on. She was grateful for his restraint. She was also, in a way she would not examine too closely until much later, disappointed by it. He touched the brim of his hat, walked down the porch steps, and swung up onto his horse. Miguel waved grandly. Denny shouted something cheerful that the wind carried away before she could decipher it, and they rode north into the dark. Clara stood on her porch for a long time after. The letter came 3 weeks later. She was at the dry goods store when Pete Elkins, who managed the general delivery with the relaxed efficiency of a man who considered himself a secondary institution of the territory, reached under the counter and produced an envelope with her name written on it in a hand that was more careful than ornamental, each letter distinct, the words spaced evenly, the handwriting of a man who had not had much formal schooling but had put genuine effort into every letter he made. She did not open it until she was home. She sat at the kitchen table, set the envelope in front of her, made coffee, and then opened it. It was 2 pages, written on both sides, and he had a great deal more to say in writing than she might have expected from a man so measured in his spoken words. He wrote about the drive north, about a river crossing that had cost them 2 days and one man's boot, recovered downstream half a mile away with a look of betrayal that the man described as the most personal affront he had ever suffered. He wrote about the Colorado landscape, the way the mountains there were different from the New Mexico mountains, higher and more abrupt, as if the earth had been in a greater hurry there. He wrote about a town called Trinidad where they had stopped to resupply, and about a dance at the town hall that he had attended with Miguel and Denny, and enjoyed despite his acknowledged limitations as a dancer, limitations he described with self-deprecating precision. And at the end, in the last paragraph on the last side of the last page, he wrote, "I think about the night of your barn fire more than you might consider reasonable. I have tried to determine what it is that I think about specifically, and I believe it is this, that you sat in the dark with something terrible and did not run from it, and you let me sit with you, and it felt like the most honest thing I have participated in for a long time. I hope you are well. I hope Patience is well. I hope the fence post situation has been addressed. Clara read the letter twice, set it down, and pressed both hands flat against the table as if steadying herself. Then she went to find paper and began to write back. Their correspondence developed over the following months with the particular intimacy that letters allow. The way writing to someone creates a kind of careful attention that conversation does not always afford. She wrote to him about the small dramas of Cimarron, about the ongoing land grant troubles that simmered and occasionally boiled over, about a dispute between two neighboring ranchers over a fence line that brought in a lawyer from Santa Fe and scandalized half the county, about the first real autumn rain that came in October and turned the creek full again, and brought such relief she had stood in it falling on her face with her eyes closed. He wrote about the cattle work, and the country, and the people he worked alongside, about a conversation with a Jicarilla Apache man near the Raton Pass who had lived in the territory his entire life, and spoke about the changes coming to the land with a steady sorrow that Eli said had stayed with him, that the man had watched his people's territory become something unrecognizable to them, treaty after treaty broken or ignored, and that the casual injustice of it had a weight that pressed on Eli in ways he had not expected. He did not moralize about it, just described what the man had said, and noted that it had changed the way he looked at the land he rode across. She found this, the fact that he had listened and been changed by it, extraordinarily attractive, not because it was admirable in some abstract sense, but because it was evidence of a certain quality of attention, the same attention he had given her on the night of the fire, the way some people actually look at what is in front of them and take it seriously. She wrote back and said so. Not in those exact words, because she had 14 months of solitude and had forgotten some of the mechanics of saying difficult things directly, but clearly enough that the meaning was not in doubt. His next letter was shorter and more concentrated, only 1 page, and it arrived 2 weeks later when the November cold had come down from the mountains and the days were getting thin and brittle. It said, "I will be in Cimarron before Christmas. If that is acceptable to you, I would very much like to see you again." She wrote back a single line, "I'll have coffee on." He arrived on the 20th of December, riding alone this time, with his saddlebags packed with the practicality of a man who has spent years on the road and knows how to carry a life's essentials in compact form. The cattle outfit had dispersed for the winter, each man going his own way until spring brought the work back. Miguel was back in Texas with his family. Denny had gone north to Denver with ambitions he had described vaguely as investment opportunities, which Miguel and Eli had agreed probably meant he had heard about a card game. Clara saw him coming from the kitchen window while she was doing exactly what she had said she would do, making coffee, and she stood at the window for a moment before she went to the door, watching him ride up the road in the pale winter light, and she felt her heart perform the same undisciplined behavior it had been performing at intervals for the past several months whenever she read one of his letters, the behavior she had been gently lecturing it about since August. She went to the door and opened it before he reached the porch. He reined in his horse and looked at her across the cold air, and the expression on his face was the one she had been carrying in her memory since August, the one that looked like wondering. "You made it," she said. "Said I would," he replied. He stabled his horse in the new structure he and Miguel and Denny had built, and the irony of this was not lost on either of them. He came in and she poured coffee and they sat across the kitchen table from each other, and for a moment just looked, the way people do after a long correspondence, reconciling the person in front of them with the person on the page. "You look," he began and stopped. "Yes," she said. "Better," he said, "than in August, healthier, more like yourself." "You don't know what my ordinary self looks like," she pointed out. "I have a working theory," he said, and there was enough of that controlled smile in it that she felt the warmth of it all the way across the table. He stayed in Cimarron for 10 days, which was the plan. He stayed for 23. He slept in the loft at the town's boarding house, which was run by a widow named Mrs. Pratt, who charged a fair rate and asked no unnecessary questions, which Clara appreciated. He came to her house in the mornings and worked on the things she had been meaning to see to: the fence post, the gate latch, a section of the house's south wall where the caulking had come loose and let in the winter wind. In the afternoons they talked. In the evenings, when the light was going, she would play the small parlor organ that had been James's mother's, brought all the way from Ohio, one of the few truly impractical things in the house, and Eli would sit near the stove and listen with the still attentive quality that she had come to understand was simply who he was. On the fourth evening he asked if he could sit closer, and she said yes. He moved his chair to within an arm's reach of the organ bench, and sat there while she played hymns and a couple of Stephen Foster songs she had known since childhood, and the proximity of him was something she was acutely and pleasantly aware of, the warmth of another person, the specific gravity of someone who has chosen to be near you. On the eighth evening she stopped playing mid-song and turned on the bench to look at him and said, without premeditation, "Are you going to say it, or are we going to continue in this fashion indefinitely?" He looked at her without surprise. He seemed, if anything, slightly relieved. "I was working up to it," he said. "Work faster." He got up from his chair and stood in front of her, and she turned the rest of the way on the bench so she was facing him, and he took her hands in both of his with that steadiness that she had thought about on no fewer than 40 separate occasions in the past 4 months. "I love you," he said. "I have been trying to determine whether it was too soon to say it, and I have decided the whole concept of too soon is not something I can apply to this particular situation with any accuracy." "I love you too," she said. "I have been trying to determine the same thing." He bent down and kissed her then, and it was not the tentative kiss of uncertainty, but the unhurried kiss of a man who is certain of what he wants and is giving it the attention it deserves. She put her hands against his chest, felt the solid reality of him, and kissed him back. They stayed at a proper distance after that, because it was 1878 and she was a widow, and it mattered to her what the women of Cimarron thought, not out of vanity, but out of the practical reality that reputation was infrastructure on the frontier, and she had built hers carefully. But the distance between them was different now, chosen rather than maintained out of uncertainty, and the difference was everything. He asked her to marry him on the 15th evening in the kitchen, while she was washing dishes and he was drying them, and they were arguing amicably about whether beans cooked better on low heat for a long time or high heat for a short time, which was, he told her later, either the most romantic or the least romantic context for a proposal, depending on how you looked at it. He set the dish towel down and turned to her and said, "Clara, I want to marry you. I want to stay here in this territory and build something that's worth building with you. I can work cattle locally. There's ranches around here that hire drovers, and I'm not afraid of any kind of work. I don't want to ride north every spring and write you letters. I want to be here, if you'll have me." She had stopped washing dishes. She was holding a clean plate and looking at him and thinking of the first moment she had seen him, climbing off his horse in the firelight with nothing but the instinct to ask if anyone was hurt. "Yes," she said, "I'll have you." They were married in February 1879 at the small Methodist church in Cimarron, in a ceremony conducted by Reverend Pierce, who had a tendency toward lengthy sermons that he mercifully reined in for the occasion. Mrs. Alvarez made Clara a dress of ivory wool, simple but well cut, with buttons she had ordered specially from the catalog. Miguel came back from Texas for the occasion and stood as Eli's witness, and Mrs. Pratt sat in the front pew and wept decorously into an excellent handkerchief. Denny sent a letter from Denver saying he had very much wanted to come, but had been unavoidably detained by what he described only as a situation, which both Eli and Miguel said was entirely consistent with the Denny they knew. The winter was cold but not brutal, and the two of them began the project of a life together with the particular combination of tenderness and practicality that the frontier required. Eli hired on with a ranching operation called the Tanner Spread, 8 miles east of Cimarron, working as a drover and fence manager and general all-purpose hand, in the way that men of his skills were valued in the territory. He rode out before sunrise most mornings and came back at dusk, and the evenings they spent the way they had spent those early winter evenings, talking, playing the parlor organ, working through the accumulation of things that needed doing. He was a good husband in the way that mattered most, which was that he was genuinely interested in Clara as a person and treated her opinions as worth having. When she decided that she wanted to expand the garden and attempt a small commercial operation selling vegetables at the market in town, he supported this without condescension and helped her figure out the water situation, which involved a new cistern and a gravity-fed irrigation system that they built together over 3 weekends in March while disagreeing productively about engineering. The Colfax County troubles were still running their course. There were confrontations between settlers and the men associated with the land grant interests, and occasional acts of violence that passed through the community like dark weather. Eli was careful and Clara was practical, and together they stayed out of the direct line of it while acknowledging that the people being displaced and harassed had legitimate grievances that deserved acknowledgement. They were not people who looked away from injustice, but they were also not people who sought out danger, and the balance they struck was one of many quiet agreements they reached in the first months of their marriage. In April, Clara realized she was pregnant. She told Eli on a Sunday morning before he had fully woken up, sitting on the edge of the bed in the early light, and she watched his face move through a sequence of expressions so rapid and genuine that she almost laughed. From confusion to comprehension to a wonder so complete, it seemed to rearrange his features. He sat up and took her face in both hands the way he did sometimes when he wanted to look at her properly, and he said, "A baby," in the voice of a man to whom this fact is so large it requires the simplest possible language. "A baby," she confirmed. He kissed her forehead and pulled her to him, and she felt his chest rise and fall with a breath so deep it was nearly a shudder. And she understood that what she was feeling pressed against her was not simply happiness, but something of larger scope, the feeling of being part of something that extends past yourself, past your own story, into the future. The pregnancy was not easy. The summer heat returned with the same ferocity as the year before, and Clara was tired in a way that went to the bone, and there were several weeks in July and August when the nausea was significant enough that she had to abandon the garden to Eli's less expert but enthusiastic management, which produced results she was diplomatic about. Her neighbor, a woman named Rosa Delgado, who was the wife of the man who had looked at Clara's well the year before, came twice a week to help with the household tasks that had become difficult, and the friendship between them that had been cordial became, in those months, something warmer and more solid. Eli came home from the Tanner Spread every evening and sat with her on the porch in the cooling air and told her about the day, the small events of ranch life, told with the attention to detail and the understated humor that she had come to rely on as one of the day's reliable pleasures. He was not a man who minimized her discomfort or told her she was making too much of it, and he was not a man who became frightened by it and pulled away. He simply stayed near. On a November evening, 3 weeks before the baby was due, Clara was sitting at the kitchen table writing her monthly letter to her mother in Missouri, when a mild but insistent discomfort began in her lower back that she recognized with some anxiety as labor beginning early. She set down her pen, put both hands on the table and breathed for a moment. Then she got up and went to find Eli. He was in the small barn, checking on Patience, who had developed a new habit of pushing her water trough sideways that he was trying to discourage through a system of propped boards. He came out of the barn when she appeared in the doorway, and he took one look at her face and was across the yard in 4 strides. "Is it time?" he asked. "I think it's beginning to be time," she said. "Rosa," he said, meaning go get Rosa, which was their plan. "Yes," she agreed. "Will you ride?" "Right now," he said. He saddled up and rode to the Delgado place at a fast canter and came back 20 minutes later with Rosa, who arrived with a bag of supplies and the brisk confidence of a woman who had delivered 7 of her own children and assisted with numerous others, and was not going to be rattled by anything the night produced. It was a long night. Not dangerous, Rosa told them at several points, with the authority of experience, not dangerous but also not quick. The baby, she said, was in the right position, and Clara was strong, and everything was as it should be. It was just a matter of time and patience. Eli sat with her through all of it. He sat in the chair beside the bed and held her hand when she wanted it held and gave her space when she needed space, and said nothing at all when words would have been too much. He brought water and wiped her face with a cool cloth, and when, at some point well after midnight, she said through clenched teeth that she was tired, he said, with the quiet certainty she had come to trust completely, that she was the strongest person he had ever known and that he was not going anywhere. The baby arrived in the dark hours before dawn, a boy with a voice of considerable conviction, and Rosa placed him in Clara's arms and said he was perfect, and Clara looked down at the small red face of her son and felt something she had no language for, something that was larger than any word she knew. She looked up and found Eli. He was standing at the side of the bed, looking at the baby, and his face was doing the same thing it had done in April when she told him, that rapid, honest sequence of feeling, but slower this time, more settled, as though the feeling were finding its permanent place in him. "Hello," she said, to both of them, father and son. Eli sat on the edge of the bed, and Rosa politely found something to occupy herself with in the kitchen, and the 3 of them spent the first gray hour of the morning in the particular quiet of a family finding itself. They named him James Thomas Cade, James for the man Clara had loved before and lost, which she had worried about suggesting. But Eli said immediately that it was right, that a man should be honored by the woman who loved him, and Thomas for Eli's brother-in-law's cruces, who sent a letter of such heartfelt congratulation that it made Clara cry, which she could not entirely blame on the exhaustion. Thomas Eli Tanner, who was not their son but their neighbor's boy of 11 who had appointed himself the unofficial assistant to everything that happened at the Cade farm, arrived the morning after the birth with a basket of eggs from his mother, and stood on the porch with enormous self-importance, and said he was available to help with whatever was needed. Eli thanked him with complete seriousness and put him to work. The months that followed were difficult in the ordinary ways and extraordinary in the ways that a new life brought. James Thomas was a healthy and opinionated infant who had strong feelings about sleeping schedules, specifically that he did not care for them, and Clara navigated the territory of early motherhood with the same determined competence she brought to everything, supplemented by Rosa's practical advice and Eli's willingness to take the baby in the pre-dawn hours so she could sleep. There was a morning in spring, James Thomas perhaps 3 months old, when Clara woke from a genuine 4 hours of sleep to find Eli sitting in the chair by the window with the baby asleep against his chest, both of them still, the morning light coming in sideways across them, and the sight of it made her throat close with a feeling too large for the ordinary word happiness. It was something older than happiness. It was the feeling of home, built not from boards and nails, but from the presence of people who chose to be there. Spring brought the cattle work back, and Eli negotiated with the tanner spread to work a modified schedule, 4 days a week instead of 6, which meant a modest reduction in pay but meant he was home more, and both of them agreed that the trade was correct. He was also beginning to look seriously at a piece of land adjacent to their own that was coming up for sale, a 20-acre parcel with good water access, the kind of expansion that would allow them to run their own small herd rather than working always on someone else's behalf. The land grant troubles in Cimarron were slowly resolving, though not without cost. Several families had been driven off land they had worked for years by legal maneuvers connected to the Maxwell Land Grant Company, and the injustice of it was plain to anyone willing to look at it plainly. Eli gave what testimony he could in support of two neighboring families whose claims were being contested, and Clara organized with Mrs. Alvarez and Rosa Delgado, and a handful of other women to provide practical support to the families who were displaced: food, clothing, assistance with transportation. It was not a large gesture, and it did not change the structural facts of power in Colfax County, but it was what was available to them, and they did it without sentiment or self-congratulation. Miguel came through Cimarron in the summer, on his way north, and was introduced to James Thomas with the gravity appropriate to the occasion. He held the baby with the careful tenderness of a large man who is very aware of his own size, and said something in Spanish that made Rosa, who was visiting, laugh. When asked for a translation, Rosa said only that it was very complimentary to both the baby and his mother, and Miguel looked pleased. Denny's situation in Denver had apparently resolved itself, though he never provided details, and he arrived in August, thinner than before and with a new hat that was aggressively optimistic about his economic circumstances. He declared James Thomas the finest baby he had ever seen, which was not a category he had previously shown any expertise in, and ate a quantity of food at Clara's table that confirmed he had not been eating well for some time. They sent him south with a supply of Clara's preserved goods and Eli's firm instruction to write to them when he got where he was going. The letters from Clara's mother in Missouri had been consistent all year, warm and a little wistful, full of news about the Missouri neighborhood that felt both close and enormously far away. In September, her mother wrote that she had not been well, that her heart was giving her trouble in the way the doctor described with technical language that her mother translated as meaning she should probably come to see Clara while she still could. Clara read this letter at the kitchen table while James Thomas sat in the wooden chair Eli had built and chewed thoughtfully on a wooden spoon. She read it twice, carefully, and then she and Eli had the conversation that needed to be had. They arranged for her mother to make the journey west. It took considerable planning, because the railroad was still being built, and the trip from Missouri to New Mexico Territory in 1880 was not a small undertaking for an aging woman in uncertain health. But Rosa's husband knew a man who managed freight shipments along the route, and he coordinated the arrangement with the practical efficiency that was his particular gift. And in October, Clara's mother, Edith Hennessy, arrived at the Cimarron depot in a state of combined exhaustion and determination that was entirely recognizable to Clara as hereditary. Edith was 61, small, with white hair and the kind of eyes that missed nothing and forgave most things. She looked at Eli with the careful attention of a mother who has been reading letters about a man for the better part of 2 years and is now able to form her own opinion. Eli stood on the platform and took off his hat and said, "Mrs. Hennessy, I'm very glad to finally meet you." Edith looked at him for a long moment and then said, "Well, you're taller than I expected from the letters." Clara's descriptions tend toward understatement, Eli said with a contained smile. Edith looked at Clara. "I like him," she said. "You can keep him." She stayed for 4 months, and it was among the finest periods of Clara's adult life. Her mother and Eli developed an immediate and authentic rapport based, as far as Clara could determine, on their shared interest in arguing about the best methods for doing any given domestic task, and their shared conviction that Clara was right about everything. Her mother held James Thomas for hours at a stretch and called him her heartbeat, and the baby, now pulling himself upright on furniture and regarding the world with the fierce, interested gaze he had apparently inherited from both sides of his family, seemed equally taken with her. It was Edith who told Clara, one afternoon when Eli was at the ranch and James Thomas was napping, about the particular quality of Eli's love. "I have known men in my life," Edith said, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, who were good men in the ways that were easy, who were kind when kindness cost nothing. Your father, God rest him, was that kind of man for most of our marriage. And then I have known men, not many, who were good in the ways that cost something, who stayed when it was hard, who gave their attention when it was easier not to. She looked at Clara with the eyes that missed nothing. Your Eli is the second kind. Clara looked at the table. I know, she said. The night of the fire, Edith said. You told me about it in your letter. He stayed until dawn. He did. That's all I needed to know about him, Edith said, with the simplicity of someone who has lived long enough to understand which facts matter. When the time came for Edith to return to Missouri, there were serious conversations about whether she should return at all or whether Missouri was simply where she kept her furniture. Clara wanted her to stay, and Eli said plainly that the house had room, and he would build a proper room addition in the spring if it meant Edith was there with them. But Edith shook her head and said that Missouri was where she had put down 60 years of roots, and she was too old to pull them up, and that she would come again in the spring if the doctor permitted it, and that letters were a kind of company too. She left on a cold February morning, waving from the wagon seat with the composure of a woman who does not allow goodbyes to break her in public, and Clara watched the wagon until it turned out of sight, and then turned back to her house and her husband and her son, and let herself cry properly, without management. Eli was there. He put his arm around her and they stood on the porch together in the cold air until she was done. She'll come back in spring, he said. She will, Clara agreed. And James Thomas will be walking by then, probably at speed. Clara laughed damp-eyed. The world is not ready. No, he said, and kissed the side of her head. It really isn't. Spring came to Cimarron in 1881 with a generosity that felt like an apology for the last 2 dry summers. The rains came in good measure. The creek ran full, and Clara's expanded garden plot came in with a productivity that kept her busy and made a genuine contribution to their household finances. She had also developed, over the past year, a secondary business in preserved goods, her jellies and dried fruits and pickled vegetables, finding a reliable market at Elkins's store, and among several of the ranching families to the east who were glad to purchase what they could not produce themselves. Eli's careful saving through the winter had brought them close enough to their goal that in March he went to speak to the man who owned the adjacent parcel, a rancher named Webb who was selling because his brother in Colorado had taken ill, and he needed to liquidate some assets. The negotiation took 3 visits and the price was fair, and on a Tuesday morning Eli came home and put the deed on the kitchen table and looked at Clara with the expression she associated with things he had worked hard for. She picked up the deed and read it and set it down and said, "It says Eli James Cade and Clara Marie Cade." "It does," he said. "You put both our names on it." "The land is ours," he said, as though this were the simplest possible fact, which to him it was. It was the kind of moment that did not require large gestures. She reached across the table and took his hand, and he turned his palm up and held hers, and James Thomas, who was now 14 months old and fully ambulatory, and conducting a one-toddler investigation of every object in the house at ground level, came barreling across the kitchen floor and grabbed both their legs simultaneously, which they both took as his endorsement of the transaction. They ran 10 head of cattle on the new land by summer's end, which was a modest beginning, and Eli continued his part-time work at the tanner spread while they built the herd. Clara managed the household economy with a precision that would have impressed a bank clerk, keeping the accounts in a notebook she had bought for the purpose, tracking income from the garden and the preserved goods, and the cattle sales and expenditures for supplies and equipment and the occasional luxury, which in their household tended to be books ordered from the catalog, a shared weakness that had revealed itself early in their marriage, and that neither of them showed any intention of reforming. The room addition Eli had promised Edith was built in June, in anticipation of her summer visit. She came in July, in better health than the winter had promised, with a trunk and a cheerful determination to be useful. She was useful. She was also excellent company, and the summer months with her there had the quality that Clara associated with the best kind of abundance, not excess, but fullness, the feeling of a house that contains all the right people. James Thomas at 20 months was exactly the magnitude of chaos that experience had prepared them for, and somehow more. A small boy of fierce opinions and considerable velocity, who had his father's watchful eyes and his mother's stubbornness, and the particular combination of both that produced, at regular intervals, standoffs of impressive duration over things like the wearing of hats and the eating of beans. Edith found this hilarious and consistently sided with James Thomas, which Eli said was a natural law of grandmothers, and he accepted it as such. There was a morning in late July when Clara came out to the garden early, before the heat, and found Eli already there, working on the irrigation channel, and her mother sitting on the overturned barrel she had claimed as her outdoor seat, watching James Thomas navigate the garden rows with a seriousness of purpose and a stick he had declared essential equipment. The morning light was golden and thin, and the mountains were blue and sharp against the sky, and the whole scene had the quality of a painting, the kind that a person carries in their memory for the rest of their life, not because anything dramatic was happening in it, but because everything ordinary was happening in it at once, and the ordinariness was full of love. She stood at the edge of the garden and looked at it for a long moment before anyone noticed her. Then James Thomas spotted her and came running with the stick and the announcements about whatever he had discovered, and the moment became the next moment, which was also good. Edith went back to Missouri in September, in better health than she had arrived, and with a general promise to return the following summer that she kept for the next 6 years, until she passed peacefully in her sleep at 68, having had her morning coffee and her letters read to her by the neighbor woman, and having said, apparently, that she was satisfied. Clara received that letter in the spring of 1887 and grieved genuinely and without reservation, and Eli sat with her through that night too, not speaking much, just present, the way he was present for everything she needed him present for. But that was still ahead of them in 1881, the September when Edith left and the fall came in cool and clear and full of the particular beauty of New Mexico in October, the cottonwoods going gold along the creek, the mountains gaining their first snow at the peaks, the air having that crystalline quality that made everything look sharper than usual. They were sitting on the porch in the evening, James Thomas finally asleep, which had required negotiation, when Clara told Eli she thought she might be pregnant again. He looked at her with the same expression he always had for large news, that steady, attentive stillness. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Not entirely, but probably." He reached over and took her hand. "How do you feel about it?" She considered this honestly, the way she considered most things. "I feel," she said, "like we are building something larger than I had planned, and I find that I am glad about it." "I'm glad about it," he said. "I'm very glad about it." The second child was a boy too, born in May 1882, with brown hair and the beginnings of what would develop into his father's coloring and his mother's observant eyes. They named him Robert William Cade, Robert for no particular reason except that it seemed to suit him immediately, and William for Clara's father, whose memory she carried in the quiet way she carried all her important things. Robbie, as he was called from the first week, was a different temperament from James Thomas, calmer, more watchful, happy to sit in a lap for long periods studying whatever was nearby with an intensity that was, Eli said, going to make him either a very good reader or an outstanding tracker, both of which were worthwhile. The Cade household in 1882 was a place of organized energy. 2 small boys, an expanding cattle operation, a productive garden, Clara's preserved goods business, Eli's work, and the ongoing maintenance of 40 acres plus the adjacent 20 that were now jointly theirs. It was a full life in every sense, the kind of fullness that required planning and negotiation and the willingness to be tired and still keep going. They had found, in the years of their marriage, a way of being together that accommodated both of their particular characters. Clara was organized and direct, a woman who liked things decided and settled. Eli was patient and thorough, a man who preferred to think before he spoke, and who did not mind revisiting a question if the first answer turned out to be wrong. These qualities, which could have produced friction, instead produced a household that was both efficient and thoughtful, where decisions were made together, and neither person felt that their judgment was dismissed. They argued sometimes. All people who live closely together argue sometimes, and they were no exception. There was a substantial disagreement in the fall of 1882 about whether to sell the cattle herd for a guaranteed price from a buyer in Raton, or hold them through winter for a better market. And this argument was conducted with the full engagement of two people who both had well-reasoned positions and were not going to yield easily. Clara wanted to take the certain money. Eli wanted to wait. They went 3 rounds over 3 evenings, laying out their reasoning each time with increasing elaboration, until Clara laughed and said that they were going to talk themselves in a complete circle, and they agreed to split the difference and sell half the herd. The market in spring was better than either had projected, which Clara declared made her right, and Eli declared made him right, and they agreed that they were both right in a way that made them both laugh. Miguel came through again in 1883, this time with a woman, his wife Carmela, whom he had married the previous autumn in a ceremony he described as lasting 3 days and being more ceremonially rigorous than he had anticipated. Carmela was small and quick and had opinions about cooking that she shared with Clara immediately and in detail, and within an hour they were in the kitchen together conducting an assessment of Clara's spice situation that produced a list of acquisitions Clara sent to the catalog immediately. Miguel and Eli sat on the porch and watched the boys and talked with the ease of men who had shared enough to make conversation comfortable even after long absences. Denny, reliable in his unreliability, had apparently settled in Denver in a sufficiently stable fashion to have married as well, to a woman named Helen who worked in a millinery shop, and from his description, managed him with a competence and cheerfulness that he clearly found both baffling and wonderful. He sent Christmas letters and occasional gifts of no particularly predictable variety, and this pattern continued and became one of the small, reliable pleasures of the year. James Thomas, at 4, had developed the skills and temperament of a boy who would clearly be his father's shadow on the ranch as soon as he was allowed, and the negotiations about when he would be allowed to ride independently were ongoing. Robbie, at 2, was in the methodical process of conducting an empirical investigation of everything within his reach, which was an increasingly large radius as his mobility improved. In 1884, Clara's business in preserved goods had grown enough that she hired Rosa Delgado's eldest daughter, Lucia, 16 and competent and serious-minded, to help with the production 2 days a week. This was a genuine employment with genuine wages, and the arrangement worked well for everyone. Lucia learned from Clara, and Clara had help, and Rosa was pleased, and the relationship between the Cade household and the Delgado family, already warm, became warmer. The Colfax County troubles had largely settled by the mid-1880s, though the land grant question left long shadows. Families who had been displaced remained displaced. The legal machinery of the territory had favored the established interests in most cases, and while Clara and Eli did not have the power to undo what had been done, they were consistent in their acknowledgement of the injustice, and in whatever small practical ways were available to them, keeping good relationships with the families who had been treated unfairly, supporting with their business and their patronage the people who had been pressed down. The Jicarilla Apache community near the territory continued to face the pressures of federal policy that sought to remove, consolidate, and restrict, and Eli, who had not forgotten the conversation near Raton Pass years earlier, was consistent in his position that these people had been in this country before any of the current residents, and were owed a respect that the law largely failed to provide. It was not a popular opinion in all quarters of Cimarron, but he held it without aggression and without retreat, and over time it became simply a known fact about Eli Cade that he was a man who held a broader view of who had claims on this land and what was owed to them. By 1885, James Thomas was 7, and in the Territory School, a structure 3 miles from the house that he walked to with 2 other children from neighboring farms, which became, in the manner of children's independent activities, a social world of its own that he reported on with selective detail. He was reading ahead of his class, a fact that Clara took serious pride in and Eli said was inevitable given the number of books in the house. Robbie, at 3, was already showing signs of wanting whatever his brother had, which James Thomas found variably endearing and irritating in the way of siblings everywhere. Clara was 31 in 1885, and she was a different person than she had been in 1878. Not unrecognizably different, not transformed in the dramatic way of stories, but deepened. She carried more than she had once carried, more history, more love, more loss, the loss of James to consumption and her father before him, and the smaller losses that accumulate across 7 years of life fully lived. She was also more certain, more rooted. She knew the particular quality of light on her land at every hour of every season. She knew which spots in the garden held the most heat and which grew cold first. She knew the sound her house made in different winds. She knew, most particularly, the sound of Eli's footsteps on the porch steps coming home. Eli at 35 was the kind of man that years of honest work and honest living had made physically stronger, but also somehow gentler, as though the certainty of who he was had relaxed something that had once been held tense. He had lines around his eyes from the sun and from laughing, and his hands were rougher than ever but moved with the same deliberate care. He was a man who was known in the community as reliable, fair, and uncommonly steady. Women asked his advice on practical matters with the casualness that indicated they trusted him. Men respected him without the competitive edge that some men generated. He was, Clara thought sometimes with a private pride that surprised her in its intensity, exactly who he appeared to be. They had one more child in the summer of 1886, a girl they named Edith Rose, Edith for Clara's mother, who wrote from Missouri that this was the greatest honor she had ever been offered and enclosed a pressed flower from her garden. Rose was a sunny, easy baby after the early intensity of the boys, though this Clara suspected was relative, and she should not congratulate herself too soon. She was born in June with a full head of dark hair that made the midwife Rosa, who had been there for all 3 births, say that this one would grow up to be interesting, which was either a promise or a warning. The 3 children were a universe in themselves. James Thomas at 8 already quietly authoritative in the way of eldest children, Robbie at 5 still conducting his investigations of the world with scientific thoroughness, and baby Edith Rose the newest discovery in both their investigations. Clara watched her children with the particular love of a mother who has thought about love enough to understand what it is, not a feeling only but a practice, the repeated choice to attend. One September evening in 1886, when the mountains had their first snow, and the cottonwoods were gold and James Thomas was at the kitchen table doing his lessons, and Robbie was already asleep, and Edith Rose was in her cradle making the small sound she made when she was between sleep and waking. Clara was sitting on the porch watching the last of the light go off the mountains when Eli came and sat beside her. They had been sitting together on this porch for 7 years. They had watched seasons and weather and the long, slow change of the land from this porch, and each evening the porch was a kind of resolution, the day closing into the 2 of them sitting together in the manner they had established so early and kept so consistently that it had become the shape of the day itself, the thing the day ended with. He reached over and took her hand in the dark, and she turned her hand over and held his. "Do you remember," she said, "the morning after the barn fire? When you rode back to camp?" "I remember," he said. "I stood in the yard and watched you go, and I thought that I had not felt alone all night." He was quiet in the way he was always quiet when she said something that landed fully. "I had been managing," she said, "for more than a year, managing everything by myself, and it was all right, I was all right. But that night I realized that managing alone is not the same as not being alone, and that I had been missing the second thing for a long time without knowing exactly what it was I was missing. I know what I thought," he said, riding back to camp that morning. "Tell me." "I thought that I had been moving from place to place for 10 years, following the work, and it had never felt like anything was missing because I didn't have anything to compare it to. And then I sat with you that night and I thought this is the thing I didn't know I was missing. This is what staying feels like." Clara looked at the dark mountains. The stars were beginning one at a time, and the air had that cold mineral quality that New Mexico evenings took on in fall, the smell of high altitude and distance. "You stayed," she said. "I stayed," he said. From inside the house came the sound of James Thomas pushing back from the table, and the particular sequence of sounds that meant he was getting himself ready for bed. The boots, the water, the creaking board in the hall that no one had been able to fix definitively. And from the cradle through the open window came the small sounds of Edith Rose settling into proper sleep. Clara turned her head and looked at Eli in the dark, and he was already looking at her, the way he often was when she turned, as though he had been watching while she watched the mountains. "I love you," she said. "I love you," he said. "In every possible way that means something." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and his arm came around her, and they sat in the manner of people who have built something together over years and feel the weight and the rightness of it. The stars continued to organize themselves overhead, the same stars that had watched the barn burn 8 years ago, the same indifferent and beautiful sky, except that now the world beneath it was full in the way that mattered most, full of the right people in the right place. James Thomas called good night from inside. Eli called back. The house settled into the sounds of children sleeping. The night was very quiet and they were in it together, and neither of them was alone. 3 years later, in the spring of 1889, when the New Mexico Territory was beginning to look toward statehood, and the railroad had come close enough to Cimarron to change the pace of things, Eli and Clara added the last piece of their land acquisition, a creekfront parcel of 15 acres that gave them good water access for the herd that had grown now to 40 head. James Thomas, 11 and already riding with his father on weekend mornings, walked the new land with Eli and Clara, and said with the seriousness of a boy who has been listening to adult conversations about land for his entire conscious life, that the pasture grass looked good, and the creek bank needed shoring up on the south side. Eli looked at Clara and Clara looked at Eli, and they both looked at their son, and the pride in that moment was of the specific variety that comes from watching a person become who they are going to be. Robbie, 7 and in school, and conducting an ongoing correspondence in his own laboriously careful printing with his grandmother Edith in Missouri, had declared his ambition to be a doctor, which Eli said was excellent because they needed someone in the family who could read the medical catalog entries without getting confused. Edith Rose at 3 was exactly the person Rosa had promised she would be, interesting, which in practice meant she had opinions about everything and expressed them in full, and was already negotiating with her brothers with a strategic sophistication that left them both slightly baffled. Lucia Delgado had married a good man from Raton and moved north, and her younger sister Carmen had taken over helping with Clara's preserved goods business, which by 1889 was supplying 3 stores in addition to Elkins, and had become a genuine commercial operation that contributed materially to the household. Clara managed it with the same notebook system she had used since the beginning, updated and expanded, and she had begun teaching Carmen the bookkeeping as well as the production, because she believed that a woman who understood her own accounts was in a fundamentally better position in the world, and this was something she had discovered through experience and wanted to pass on. Denny came through in the summer of 1889 with Helen, his wife, making their way south from Denver for reasons Denny described as complex, and Helen described, with the calm precision of a woman who had been managing complexity for some years, as a fresh start. They were looking at property in the territory, Helen said, and she had an organized list of considerations and questions that Clara recognized as the approach of someone who was serious about the decision, and not inclined to be swept up in Denny's enthusiasms without structural support. They stayed for a week, and by the end of it, Helen and Clara had established a friendship of the particular kind that begins with mutual recognition. Two women who have thought seriously about their lives and are glad to find another person who has done the same. Helen and Denny ultimately settled in Las Cruces rather than Cimarron, but the friendship continued by letter, and the proximity to Thomas Cade, Eli's younger brother, who was still ranching near Las Cruces, created a web of connection that made the territory feel smaller and fuller. Miguel and Carmela came through every year or two, always with news, always with food that Carmela brought or made immediately upon arrival, and the table at the Cade house expanded to accommodate them with the ease of a household that is accustomed to hospitality. Their children and the Cade children knew each other as a kind of extended family, the way frontier communities created kinship out of chosen loyalty when blood relations were too far away. In the fall of 1889, Eli Cade turned 39. Clara made him a cake with dried apricots, which were his preference, and James Thomas gave him a drawing he had made of the ranch, the house and barn and pastures rendered with more accuracy than artistry, which Eli regarded with the seriousness appropriate to genuine art. Robbie gave him a rock that he had selected from the creek on the basis of criteria he explained at length. Edith Rose gave him a hug of such forceful enthusiasm that it nearly knocked him from his chair. Clara gave him, in the evening after the children were in bed, a small book she had ordered from the catalog 6 months prior, a collection of poems she had selected after considerable thought because she knew he would read them. He opened it and sat for a while turning the pages, and when he looked up his expression was the one she associated with things that had reached him. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome," she said. They sat by the stove with coffee, the way they sat most evenings, and the house was quiet around them with the particular quality of a house in which children are sleeping, that specific held-breath quiet. And outside the September night was cool, and the mountains were there in the dark as they always were, as they had always been, older than anyone's claim on them. He opened the book to a page he had stopped at and read her a stanza, in the low, careful voice he used for reading aloud, the voice she had heard reading to the children since James Thomas was old enough to sit still, and the words in the quiet of the room had the quality of something true. She watched him read, and she thought about the barn, black against the orange light of 1878, and the man who had sat down in the dirt beside her without being asked. She thought about the letters, the careful handwriting, the precise and honest words. She thought about the kitchen, the question of beans, the deed with both their names on it. She thought about 3 children sleeping down the hall and a 4th summer's worth of preserved goods in the cellar and 40 acres of good land and a herd of 40 cattle and a fence post on the south side that was holding up fine because someone had replaced it properly 8 years ago. She thought about the night she had not been alone. She had not been alone since. He finished the stanza and looked up and found her watching him, and she did not look away. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said, "just you." He set the book down and reached across the small table between them, and she met his hand with hers. And they sat that way in the warm kitchen with the dark mountains outside, and the children breathing in their sleep and the life they had built from a burned-down barn. and a night that had felt like the end of things but had turned out to be something else entirely, the particular beginning of everything that mattered, and neither of them let go. The New Mexico Territory would become a state in 1912, long after the children were grown, and James Thomas would be there to see it, a man in his 40s with land of his own and children of his own, who had learned from his parents the specific art of staying, of choosing the same person and the same place every morning with full knowledge and full heart. Robbie did become a doctor, educated in Albuquerque and practicing in Cimarron, who kept his father's habit of listening completely and his mother's habit of thinking clearly. Edith Rose married at 22 and settled in Taos, near enough for visits, far enough for her own story, which she wrote with the boldness that Rosa had predicted when she was 3 days old. But all of that was ahead of them, on the September evening in 1889 when they sat in the kitchen of the house they had made, holding hands across the table while the stove ticked and the mountains stood in the dark. Eli Cade had sat with her through the longest night of her life, 11 years ago now, beside the embers of a burning barn, without being asked and without needing to be thanked, simply because it was the right thing to do and because he was, at his foundation, a man who stayed. And Clara Cade, who had come to this dry red territory with grief in the straight line of her back and had managed, alone for 14 hard months, had never felt alone again. Not once, not ever. Not from that first gray dawn when she watched him ride north and understood what his presence had given her, all the way through to this evening, and every evening that followed, for the rest of the long and full and ordinary and extraordinary life they built together, in the territory that the Sangre de Cristo Mountains watched over with their ancient patience and their blood-colored light. Not once alone, never alone again.